Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 224, The Crimes of Sherlock Holmes. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, it would be a crime if I didn't say, hi, how are you today?
Oh, it would be a crime if I didn't answer, why, Scott, I'm just fine.
I'm reminded of, I think it was Rumpel A La Carte, one of the short stories by John Mortimer, where Horace Rumpel went into a fancy restaurant, dragged there by Hilda, she who must be obeyed, of course, and her cousin Everard. And the proprietor of the restaurant, Jean-Pierre O'Higgins, was a rather combative type. And, well, let's just say Rumpel didn't really care for the portion size at Jean-Pierre's, and made it very clear to the executive chef, and the chef made his displeasure known to Rumpel, and Cousin Everard introduced him as Horace Rumpel, the criminal lawyer.
Criminal lawyer, eh? Jean-Pierre was unappeased. Well, don't commit your crimes in my restaurant.
I remember that about Rumpel in the restaurant, yeah.
Well, we are here neither to talk about restaurants nor to be criminal ourselves, but to let you know that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles224, all lowercase, and that will take you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com to the specific episode here. There you can do all kinds of things, like leave us a comment, which of course you can do by also emailing us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com if anything's on your mind, if you want to give us feedback about the show, or if you have suggestions for new shows. We do encourage you to do that, and follow us on social media, where we are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places. We appreciate your attention. In the meantime, let's get going. The Crimes of Sherlock Holmes. Well, it sounds like the case of, it sounds like a new volume of short stories, an anthology.
It sounds like a parallel universe, another universe in which Holmes is very Raffles-like, and Raffles is undoubtedly very Sherlock-like.
I like that. Well, it's interesting because we have come to know Sherlock Holmes as a man who is ultimately interested in justice. And we see him standing for that which is wrong and needs righting in the Victorian world. And of course, we also know that the Victorian world was very much interested not only in Sherlock Holmes and his methods, the scientific method and the ability to take these processes and define them discreetly rather than to make more magic about them. But the Victorian world was also very interested in order, creating order out of chaos. And, certainly that comes in the form of punishing criminals. And yet, Sherlock Holmes used his own brand of justice, which at times meant going outside of the law, maybe doing things that the police couldn't do. maybe arriving at a conclusion in an underhanded way, maybe even sometimes knowing who the criminal was and not doing anything about it. So let's have a discussion now about Sherlock Holmes outside the law, maybe the crimes he committed or the underhanded tactics he used that couldn't be used by the traditional police. Where would you like to begin?
Plenty of places to begin, and I think we should begin perhaps with the Priory School. But, just before we get there, my observation would be that there are occasional moments in the canon where those of us who hold Holmes as a hero feel that to some degree or other, perhaps he's coming just a bit short here. And one of them that always stood out for me was the Musgrave ritual and the poor, the confusion, sort of the absence of a resolution around Rachel Howells, the maid whom we are led to believe was instrumental in the death of Brunton, and who it seems has drowned herself in the lake, but who then appears to have sort of escaped somehow. And people over the years have said, if Holmes was such a great detective, he would have more compassion for people like Rachel Howells. And why was she not found and helped and so on? But, if you want to consider Holmes as a mender of destinies, a righter of wrongs, then leaving her location vague and her outcome vague really was the greatest kindness, because if in fact she was involved in Brunton's death, to locate her and bring her back to justice would serve no purpose and only increase her pain and suffering. So I like to feel that what we find when Holmes appears to be compounding a felony and taking upon himself the purview of responsibilities that Scotland Yard or British justice or real courts should be taking onto themselves, that he's actually acting in a higher capacity. And I'm hopeful that, when we review some of these things, that'll become clear.
Yeah. And I think, your observation there about Rachel Howells, I hadn't thought about that one. I mean, it is one of the unresolved cases, and we've talked about unresolved cases here before. We'll have a link to that episode in the show notes. But to me, it reminds me of really a series of stories. There are at least 3 I can think of where Holmes's sentence, as if he is serving as judge and jury, not executioner in this case, but serving as judge and jury, is always a year at sea. It's like the Carnival Cruise Line teams up with Sherlock Holmes to give you a round-the-world tour of the Earth. And then in a year, what will happen? I mean, things will be right. People will have forgotten about what you did. You'll have sat in your room long enough and thought about your bad actions. I mean, let's run down each one of those and see how it really applies. The first one that comes to mind is, and this is a really difficult one because you can see how each of the individuals in this situation were conflicted. I'm thinking about the Abbey Grange, right? Sir Eustace, just a complete blackguard of a fellow to his wife, to his wife's dog. And here is Captain Jack Crocker, who she met on the ship on the way over. They kept up a relationship and very clearly were falling in love. And here comes Sir Eustace discovering them together, and Crocker kills him. Holmes brings in Watson as the jury, the gentleman of the jury. And he hears Crocker's story, and he said, how do you find? Watson says, not guilty, my lord. Now, even with a not guilty verdict, Holmes still says, why don't you get on that steamship of yours that you were going to sail on? Go away for a year and then come back for this lady. I can see the validity there because, Brackenstall was, not the nicest person. But at the same time, a murder is a murder.
True. But that is just a great example, because this is really a great illustration, of Holmes really meting out justice. And you can look at this multidimensionally. If you want to just take the point of view that this isn't really the case of Sherlock Holmes, but this is a short story that's published somewhere, written by an author who would like to be known in respectable literary circles, not for writing bloody horror, shocking stories, but for writing real craft, a real craftsman of literature. One of the things he has to think about is, how will my reader feel if I suddenly drop a ton of bricks on this particular character? I mean, my feeling as the author, he would say to himself, is I think this fellow, acted rightly, and by gad, I'd probably do the same thing if I was in his situation. And so the treatment of the character and what becomes of him is really, very just and proper. And it's also got a little glimmer of optimism, that in 12 months' time, 14 months' time, people will get back on track. Their destinies will have been mended.
Mm. I'm reminded of one of the most popular undergraduate courses at Harvard University, which is Justice. It's taught by Michael Sandel. And you can watch the very first lecture on YouTube. We'll have a link to this in the show notes, where he goes through the trolley car incident, where you're on a trolley car and it's speeding down the line and it's going to fork one way or the other. On one curve, there are 5 workers present. And on the other curve, there's simply one man sitting on the tracks eating his lunch. You don't have any brakes, but you have the ability to choose which curve it goes on. Which way would you choose? And most of the class says they will choose to go for the man peacefully eating his lunch. Why? Because risking one life for saving 5 seems just to them. And he said, okay, well, let's think about it another way. You're standing on a bridge overlooking the trolley tracks. Same trolley car is out of control. It's heading toward those 5 individuals. And standing next to you on the bridge is a very fat man who's eating his lunch. And you realize that if you pushed him over the side of the bridge and landed him in front of the trolley car, it would stop the car from killing those 5 men. What would you do? Would you push the man over? And everyone's horrified at that point, because it doesn't feel the same to them to take that innocent life who was not involved in the train scenario in any way and to put him in danger. So it's the same kind of thing, trying to figure out in your own psyche and your own moral makeup what actually is just and what makes sense to you for a case of justice. And I think based on how Watson writes this story up, it feels very right what Holmes has done, even though it's outside the confines of the law.
I couldn't agree with you more. And Sandel, I took that whole course online, and there's a book, of course, that he wrote. And, he's given a number of lectures about it. I think the whole thing is available. But the lovely part of that, and the interesting, another relevant aspect of it to this conversation, is the dialogue he has with the students in those sessions, who some of whom are coming to grips with conversations about justice in these terms for the very first time in their lives. And you could see the difficult philosophical and moral questions, but you can also see the realization in the eyes of some of them that the world is a little bit more complex than perhaps they had previously thought. And there's more nuance to these things, and things perhaps aren't black and white. And it's that sensitivity, that I think that you can apply to many of the actions of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. Well, and I think Conan Doyle does such a good job of introducing these. I mean, I remember reading these stories as a young man, as a boy, and thinking we would get to, the butler did it, and, take him away, officer. And it isn't like that. And many of these stories have either unsatisfying endings or endings where Holmes goes outside the law. We talked about the round the world cruise, Jackie Ferguson, right? That was Holmes's sentence for, in the Sussex Vampire. Oh, he tried to murder his stepbrother, his half brother. Just send him around the world, give him an all expenses paid tour of the world. The same thing. Well, actually, it wasn't a round-the-world trip for James Wilder in the Priory School, right? He was sent to Australia, which, you know, it was still coming off of its prison colony reputation at that point. But you see how many of the other characters in the Sherlock Holmes stories made their fortune in Australia. That was a reward. I mean, Holmes rewarded James Wilder, who had no claim to anything legitimately, you know, a younger half-brother or not, to the Holderness fortune. So he actually did him a favor in that case.
See, it's interesting. You know, when Adrian sat down to figure out new Sherlock Holmes stories, the exploits with John Dixon Carr, if he'd really been on the ball, he would have taken a character like James Wilder and brought him back to England with an alias, you know, and a tattoo and a bunch of things that Holmes could have spotted and said, well, wait a minute now. Don't I know you, lad?
You look familiar. Yes.
You look familiar to me, a little older.
No, it's wise. Your last name, is it Holderness? No, it's pronounced Holdernessa.
No, it's pronounced Sheffield.
Well, we will get back in just a moment with some blatant crimes to talk about right after this word. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Only your imagination limits. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today. Okay, we're back talking about the criminal Sherlock Holmes. You know, just to wrap up the turning the eye the other way when it comes to the law. Certainly the first instance of this in the Sherlock Holmes stories comes early on in The Blue Carbuncle. We have that famous scene where James Ryder is on his knees pleading with Sherlock Holmes to let him go. Holmes tells him to get back in the chair, and they work through the story together. And evidently, Ryder barely touched the stone. You know, he hid it away and never had an opportunity to make good with the spoils. And Holmes looks at him almost with, well, he looks at him with a lot of derision, but with a little pity as well. And says to Watson, you know, you make this guy a jailbird now, he's going to be a jailbird for life. You will wreck him, basically. And lets him go. Right? And he scampers down the street and he says, I suppose I am commuting a felony, which was a term, an actual legal term in British law where you exchange it for another penalty. And in this case, I would imagine the penalty for James Ryder would be probably not returning to his job at the Hotel Cosmopolitan.
Well, yes, but, you know, it's interesting that we have the case of the Blue Carbuncle early on in the adventures, as you say, and the decision to let Ryder go. And you can, you know, just 2 things cross my mind, you know, when you bring that up. One is how interesting that today in the States, there's so much of a recurring, an undercurrent and a continuing current of debate around the policies of incarceration in the United States. And the fact that certain laws, you know, and people frequently cite the drug laws, resulted in a disproportionately high level of incarceration for people of color and just as a percentage of the general population, and that this needs to be reexamined. And there you've got Holmes saying, you make this person a jailbird, you make him a jailbird for life. And then the second thing is, how different would it have been if Ryder would have said to Sherlock Holmes, yes, I took the stone and I'm proud of it, and I just regret that I could never, and you can tell immediately, therefore, that Holmes's actions are very much in concert with the personality of Ryder, and that in addition to derision and pity, and holding Ryder in a little contempt too, Holmes is being more of a humanist than one might usually think Sherlock Holmes was.
And it was partially because Ryder asked him about it. For God's sake, have mercy, he shrieked. And then here's what I think probably made a big difference to Holmes. Ryder didn't only think of himself. He thought, what would the shame be that I bring on my house? He says, think of my father, of my mother. It would break their hearts. I never went wrong before. I never will again. I swear it. Right. And that's where Holmes begins to soften a little before he hears the full tale. So, absolutely. The tenor of the prisoner or of the accused matters a great deal to Holmes, when it comes to meting out justice. Those are some of the instances of Holmes turning, not a blind eye, but at least a well-affected eye toward justice. Let's look at a couple of examples where Holmes doesn't only skirt the law, but downright breaks it. I think one of the most famous is when Holmes and Watson don their masks and their tennis shoes and sneak over, almost Scooby-Doo style, to Appledore Towers and burgle Milverton's rooms. We're ready to burgle Milverton's rooms. Of course, they had company over there. Milverton met his end, unexpectedly so. I don't think they were looking for that kind of trouble. And Holmes took 5 or 6 trips between the safe where all of Milverton's papers were and dumped them into the fire. So not only did you have breaking and entering, not only did you have witness to a murder, but you also had destruction of personal property. And then Holmes and Watson make their way across with the police hot on their heels, scrambling over the 6-foot wall and then making it back to Baker Street, only to meet with Lestrade the next day, scratching his head that, there were a couple of folks here. One of them was pretty spry. The other was more stout and square jawed. It sounds like Watson. Well, it does sound like Watson. Right? And they got away with it. Amazing.
Well, that's just one of the many lovely moments like that in the canon. It sounds like Watson, doesn't it, Lestrade? That inside joke. It's very what we would call meta today. But there, you've got the case where this is the vile blackmailer, from almost the first words of the case. We find Charles Augustus Milverton and this practice of blackmailing painted in the most ghastly, underhanded, miserable, low, awful, negative way. I mean, so clearly this is deep sin. Mm-hmm. And by putting his hands on these papers and destroying them, Holmes is saving lives and, doing his part to perhaps heal the world, heal relationships, if it's not too fanciful to think of Holmes doing that. Yeah.
And clearly they were having fun while they were doing this. He asked Watson if he had any soft shoes. He said, I've rubber-soled tennis shoes. And he said, okay, and how about a mask? Watson immediately goes, I can make a couple out of black silk. And Holmes goes, I can see you have a strong natural turn for this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that was the one. And then the other famous one is, it is in the Bruce Partington plans. Mm-hmm. When they meet up at, Galdini's Italian restaurant. And Holmes orders, cigars and curacao. And then they head off to, I guess it was Oberstein's apartment. And Holmes has his burgling kit there. Mm. And Watson, in that case, is simply assigned as the lookout. Right now, you keep an eye here. I will. And I think this is an invented line from the Granada series. Watson's a little uncertain about it at this time. And Holmes reassures him. He says, well, you keep a lookout. I'll do the criminal part. And it may not have been canonical, but it was something that would be believable in terms of the stout and sturdy Watson as companion, but, unwilling to completely cross the line of the law.
Well, too, but there, it's just another brushstroke on the character of Sherlock Holmes, who can be too frequently reduced to, sociopathic, thinking machine, no friends. This is Holmes taking upon himself the burden of breaking the law and protecting and showing his affection and regard for his close friend and associate, someone who was truly heartless and truly had no feeling and no sense of empathy would have said, sure, let's go, here, you hold the bag. I'll swing the hammer. Or would you like to swing the hammer? Yeah.
No, and I found the excerpt here. It was more dramatic than I had thought. Watson says, I don't like it, Holmes. Oh, my dear fellow, you shall keep watch in the street. I'll do the criminal part. It's not a time to stick at trifles. Think of Mycroft's note, of the Admiralty, of the Cabinet, the exalted person who waits for the news. We are bound to go. My answer was to rise from the table. You are right, Holmes. We are bound to go. He sprang up and shook my hand. I knew you would not shrink at the last, he said. And for a moment I saw something in his eyes which was nearer to tenderness than I had ever seen. The next instant, he was his masterful, practical self once more. Ha ha! Wonderful scene.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
And wonderful to hear that they talked of trifles.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Not for the first time, Holmes. You presume to take the law into your own hands.